This is the Encyclopédie on page 114 in the Norton, volume D. Africa, one of the four principal parts of the earth. It measures approximately 800 leagues from Tangiers to Suez, 1,420 from Cape Verde to Cape Guardafui, and 1,450 from the Cape of Good Hope to Bowen, longitude 1 through 71, latitude southern 1 through 35, and northern 1 through 37.30. There is little trading on the African coasts. The interior of this part of the world is still insufficiently known, and Europeans began trading only around the middle of the 14th century. There is little trade between the kingdoms of Morocco and Fez, and the area near Cape Verde. Trading posts can be found around Cape Verde and between the Senegal and the Sierra Leone rivers. The coast of Sierra Leone has been explored by the four nations, but only the Portuguese and the English have established ports. Only the English have a trading post near Cape Miserado. We do some trading along the Melagueta and the Grave coasts. We trade even more along the Little Dieppe and the Grand Sestre. The Ivory, or Tusk coast, is frequented by all Europeans. They almost all have settlements and forts along the Gold Coast. The Cape of Corsica is the main settlement of the English. There is little trade at Ostris. Many Negroes are taken from Benin and Angola. There is no activity in Kafir country. The Portuguese are established in Sofala, in Mozambique, and Madagascar. They also handle all the Malindi trade. We will follow the branches of this trade in the different articles Cape Verde, Senegal, etc. Beast, animal, brute. People use beast in contradistinction to man. Thus one says, man has a soul, but some philosophers do not concede that beasts have any at all. Brute is a term of contempt applied to beasts and to man only in a bad sense. He surrenders himself to all the fury of his inclinations, like the brute. Animal is a generic term suitable to all organic and living beings. The animal lives, acts, and moves by itself, etc. If we consider the animal as thinking, wanting, acting, reflecting, etc., then the sense of the word would be restricted to the human race. If we consider the animal to be limited in all the functions that indicate intelligence and will, but seem to have them in common with the human race, then it is restricted to the beast. If we consider the beast in its lowest depths of stupidity, released from the laws of reason and honesty according to which we must regulate our conduct, then we call it a brute. We do not know if beasts are governed by the general laws of motion, or by a particular impulse. Both of these opinions present difficulties. If they act out of a particular impulse, if they think, if they have a soul, etc., then what is that soul? We cannot suppose that it is material in nature, but could it be spiritual? To declare that they do not have souls and do not think would reduce animals to the level of machines, which we hardly seem any more authorized to do than to maintain that a man whose speech we do not hear is an automation. The argument based on the perfection of their works is strong, for it would seem, if we judge from their first steps, that they should go rather far. Nevertheless, they all stop at the same point, which is almost the character of machines. But the argument based on the uniformity of their productions does not appear quite as well founded to me. The nests of swallows and dwellings of beavers do not resemble each other any more than do the houses of men. If a swallow places its nest in an angle, the only circumference will be the arc covered between the sides of the angle. On the other hand, if the nest is set against a wall, it will measure half a circumference. If you dislodge beavers from their homes and they go settle in another location, as it is not possible for them to find the same piece of ground, there will necessarily be a variety in the techniques they use in the dwellings they construct. However that may be, one cannot imagine that beasts have a much more intimate relationship with God than the other parts of the material world. Otherwise, which one of us would dare to lay a hand on them and shed their blood without any qualms? Who would be able to kill a lamb with an easy conscience? The feelings they have, whatever their nature, are only useful in communicating with each other or with other creatures. With the incentive of pleasure, they can serve their own being, and with the same incentive, they can serve their species. I have said incentive of pleasure for lack of a more precise expression, for if beasts were capable of the same feeling which we call pleasure, to cause them any harm would be an act of unprecedented cruelty. They have their own natural laws because they are united by common needs, interests, etc., but they do not have any positive ones because they are not united by any intellectual understanding. However, they do not seem to follow their natural laws in an invariable manner, and plants which we assume have neither understanding nor feeling are even more subject to these laws. Beasts do not have the supreme advantage of human beings. However, they have some that we do not have. They do not have our hopes, but they do not have our fears. They suffer deaths as we do, but it is without knowing it. Most of them take better care of themselves and do not misuse their passions as much as we do. See the articles Soul and Animal. Education is the care one takes of feeding, bringing up, and instructing children. Thus, education has as goals 1. The health and good constitution of the body. 2. What regards the rectitude and instruction of the mind. 3. Manners, that is, the conduct of life and social qualities. Of education in general. Children who come into the world must form one day the society in which they will live. Their education is thus the most interesting subject, one, for themselves, whom education must fashion such that they will be useful to that society, obtain its esteem, and find it in their well-being. 2, for their families, whom they must support and honor. 3, for the state itself, which must reap the fruits of the good education that the citizens that compose it receive. All children who come into the world must be subjected to the care of education, for there is none who is born completely instructed and completely educated. So what advantage does not accrue every day to a state whose head has his mind cultivated early, who has learned in history that the most stable empires are exposed to revolutions, who has been as much instructed in what he owes his subjects as in what his subjects owe to him, to whom the source, the motive, the extent, and the limits of his authority have been made known, to whom it has been taught that the sole certain means of conserving it and making it be respected is to make good use of it. Erudimini qui judicatis terram, be wise, you rulers of the earth. Psalm 2:10. What happens that of a state in which magistrates have early learned their duties and have manners, where every citizen is warned in that in coming into the world he has received a talent to render valuable, that he is member of a political body, and that in this capacity he must contribute to the common good, search for everything that can produce true advantages to society, and avoid what can disrupt its harmony and disturb tranquility and good order. It is evident that there is no order of citizens in a state for whom some kind of education is not proper. Education for the children of sovereigns, education for the children of the great, for those of magistrates, etc. Education for the children of the countryside, where, in the same way that there are schools for learning the truths of religion, there should also be those in which the exercises, the practices, the duties, and the virtues of their social state could be shown to them, so that they might act with greater knowledge. If every kind of education were imparted with enlightenment and perseverance, the motherland would be well constituted, well governed, and protected from the insults of its neighbors. Education is the greatest good that fathers can leave to their children. One finds too frequently fathers who do not know their true interests, refuse to spend what is necessary for a good education, and who save nothing afterwards to provide an occupation for their children, or to lend them an honorable office. Yet what duty is more useful than a good education, which commonly does not cost so much, although it is the good whose product is the greatest, the most honorable, and the most sensible? It pays back every day. Other goods are often dissipated, but one cannot get rid of a good education, nor, unfortunately, of a bad one, which often is such because one has not wanted to defray the expenses of a good one. Give your son to be educated by a slave, said that one day an ancient philosopher to a rich father, "Very well, instead of one slave, you shall have two." There is much analogy between the cultivation of plants and the education of children. In one and in the other, nature must furnish the base. The owner of a field cannot make it be usefully cultivated unless the terrain is proper to what he wants to produce in it. Likewise, an enlightened father and a master who has discernment and experience must observe their student, and after a certain period of observation they must disentangle his penchants, his inclinations, his taste, his character, and know what he is good for, and what role, so to speak, he must play in that concert of society. Do not force the inclinations of your children, but also do not allow them to choose lightly a station for which you foresee that they will realize in time they were not suitable. One must, as much as one can see, spare them bad initiatives. Happy those children who have experienced parents capable of conducting them well in the choice of a station, a choice on which depends happiness or evil, without considering the rest of life. With regard to the mind, the first years of childhood require much more care than is commonly given to them, so that it is often very difficult afterwards to erase the bad impressions that a young man has had through the discourses and examples of people of little sense and little enlightenment, who are near him in those first few years. From the moment that a child lets it be known, by his look and by his gestures, that he understands what is said to him, he should be regarded as subject proper to be submitted to the jurisdiction of education, whose goal is to form the mind and set aside what it can lead astray. It would be desirable for him to be approached only by sensible people, and for him to see and hear nothing but good. The first instances of sensible acquiescence in our mind, or, to speak in common parlance, the first knowledge or the first ideas that form within us during the first years of our life, are as many models that is difficult to refashion, and which later serve us as rules in the use that we make of our own reason. Thus it is extremely important for a young man to acquiesce only to what is true, that is, to what is, as soon as he has judgment. So keep him away from all fabulous stories, from all puerile tales of fairies, of werewolves, of wandering Jews, of goblins, of ghosts, of wizards, of spells, told by those makers of horoscopes, those fortune-tellers, male and female, those interpreters of dreams, and so many other superstitious practices that serve only to lead astray children's reason, to frighten their imagination, and often even to make them regret having come into the world. Persons who amuse themselves by frightening children are very reprehensible. It has often happened that the weak organs of children's brains have been deranged for the rest of their lives, besides their mind being filled with ridiculous prejudices, etc. The more these chimerical ideas are extraordinary, the more deeply ingrained they become in the brain. One must not blameless those who amuse themselves by tricking children, leading them into error, deluding them into believing lies, and who congratulate themselves instead of being ashamed. In such instances, it is the young man who has the good part. He does not yet know that there are persons whose soul is low enough to speak against their thought, and who affirm shameful falsehoods in the same tone in which honest people say the most certain truths. He has not yet learned to suspect. He puts himself in your hands, and you trick him. All those false ideas become as many exemplary ideas, which lead children's reason astray. I would have it that instead of thus taming the mind of young people with charm and lies, one never told them anything but the truth. Encyclopédie, philosophy. This word means the interrelation of all knowledge. It is made up of the Greek prefix en, in, and the nouns cyclos, circle, and paideia, instruction, science, knowledge. In truth, the aim of an encyclopedia is to collect all the knowledge scattered over the face of the earth, to present its general outlines and structure to the men with whom we live, and to transmit this to those who will come after us, so that the work of past centuries may be useful to the following centuries, that our children, by becoming more educated, may at the same time become more virtuous and happier, and that we may not die without having deserved well of the human race. We have seen that our encyclopedia could only have been the endeavor of a philosophical century, that this age has dawned in that fame, while raising to immortality the names of those who will perfect man's knowledge in the future, will perhaps not disdain to remember our own names. We have been heartened by the ever so consoling and agreeable idea that people may speak to one another about us, too, when we shall no longer be alive. We have been encouraged by hearing from the mouths of a few of our contemporaries a certain voluptuous murmur that suggests what may be said of us by those happy and educated men in whose interests we have sacrificed ourselves, whom we esteem and whom we love, even though they have not yet been born. We have felt within ourselves the development of those seeds of emulation which have moved us to renounce the better part of ourselves to accomplish our task, and which we have ravished away into the void the few moments of our existence of which we are genuinely proud. Indeed, man reveals himself to his contemporaries and is seen by them for what he is, a peculiar mixture of sublime attributes and shameful weaknesses. But our weakness follow our mortal remains into the tomb and disappear with them. The same earth covers them both, and there remains only the total result of our attributes immortalized in the monuments we raise to ourselves or in the memorials that we owe to public respect and gratitude. Honors which a proper awareness of our own deserts enable us to enjoy in anticipation an enjoyment that is as pure as great, and as real as any other pleasure, and in which there is nothing imaginary, except, perhaps, the titles on which we base our pretensions. Our own claims are deposited in the pages of this work, and posterity will judge them. I have said that it could only belong to a philosophical age to attempt an encyclopedia, and I have said that this because such a work constantly demands more intellectual daring than is commonly found in ages of pusillanimous taste. All things must be examined, debated, investigated without exception, and without regard for anyone's feelings. We must ride roughshod over all these ancient purities, overturn the barriers that reason never erected, give back to the arts and sciences the liberty that is so precious to them. We have for quite some time needed a reasoning age, when men would no longer seek the rules in classical authors but in nature, when men would be conscious of what is false and true about so many arbitrary treatises on aesthetics, and I take the term treatise on aesthetics in its most general meaning, that of a system of given rules to which it is claimed that one must conform in any genre whatsoever in order to succeed. It would be desirable for the government to authorize people to go into the factories and shops, to see the craftsmen at their work, to question them, to draw the tools, the machines, and even the premises. There are special circumstances when craftsmen are so secretive about their techniques that the shortest way of learning about them would be to apprentice oneself to a master, or to have some trustworthy person do this. There would be few secrets that one could fail to bring to light by this method, and all these secrets would have to be divulged without any exception. I know that this feeling is not shared by everyone. These are narrow minds, deformed souls, who are indifferent to the fate of the human race, and who are so enclosed in their little group that they see nothing beyond its special interest. These men insist on being called good citizens, and I consent to this, provided that they permit me to call them bad men. To listen to them talk, one would say that a successful encyclopedia, that a general history of the mechanical arts should only take form of an enormous manuscript that would be carefully locked up in a king's library, inaccessible to all other eyes but his, an official document of the state, not meant to be consulted by the people. What is the good of divulging the knowledge a nation possesses, its private transactions, its inventions, its industrial processes, its resources, its trade secrets, its enlightenment, its arts, and all its wisdom? Are not these things to which it owes a part of its superiority over the rival nations that surround it? This is what they say. This is what they might add. Would it not be desirable if, instead of enlightening the foreigner, we could spread darkness over him, or even plunge all the rest of the world into barbarism, so that we could dominate more securely over everyone? These people do not realize that they occupy only a single point on our globe, and that they will endure only a moment of its existence. To this point and to this moment, they would sacrifice the happiness of future ages and that of the entire human race. They know as well as anyone that the average duration of empires is not more than 2,000 years, and that in less time, perhaps, the name of Frenchman, a name that will endure forever in history, will be sought after in vain over the surface of the earth. These considerations do not broaden their point of view, for it seems that the word humanity is for them a word without any meaning. All the same, they should be consistent, for they also fulminate against the impenetrability of the Egyptian sanctuaries. They deplore the loss of the knowledge of the ancients. They accuse the writers of the past for having been silent or negligent in writing so badly on an infinite number of important subjects. And these illogical critics do not see that they demand of the writers of earlier ages something they call a crime when it is committed by a contemporary, that they are blaming others for having done what they think it honorable to do. Lyric poetry. It is a type of poetry totally devoted to sentiment, that its substance, its essential object, whether it rises like a trembling flame, whether it seeps in, little by little, and excites us without noise, whether it is an eagle, a butterfly, a bee, it is always sentiment that guides it or carries it along. In general, lyric poetry is destined to be set to music. It is for this that it is called lyric, and because, in times past, when it was sung, the lyre accompanied the voice. The word ode has the same origin. It means song, hymn, or canticle. Thence, lyric poetry and music have an intimate connection between them, founded on things themselves, since they both have the same object to express, and if this is so, music being an expression of sentiments from the heart through inarticulate sound, musical or lyric poetry will be the expression of sentiments through articulate sound, that is to say, through words. So one can define lyric poetry as that which expresses sentiment in verse that is melodic, but as sentiments are hot, passionate, and powerful, warmth must dominate in this genre of work. Thence are born all the rules of lyric poetry, as well as its privileges. That is what allows for the boldness of beginnings, the deviations, the energy of unconventional moments. It is from here that derives this sublimity, which is so specifically belongs to it, and this enthusiasm that brings it close to the divine. Lyric poetry is as ancient as the world. When man had opened his eyes onto the universe, on the agreeable impressions that he received from all of his senses, on the marvels that surrounded him, he raised his voice to pay the tribute of the glory that he owed to the supreme benefactor, and that is the origins of hymn, odes, and in word, lyric poetry. At the base of their holidays, the pagans had the same principle as the worshippers of the true God. It was joy and gratitude that made them institute solemn games to celebrate the gods to whom they believed they were indebted for their harvest. From there came the songs of joy that they devoted to the God of harvest, and to that of love. If the beneficent gods were the natural material of lyrical poetry, heroes, children of the gods naturally to have their part in this sort of tribute, without counting that their virtue, their courage, or their favors, either to a particular people or to the human race, made them resemble divinity. We will only point out here that it is particularly to lyric poets that it is given to instruct with dignity and agreement. Dramatic and fable poetry rarely bring together these two advantages. The ode brings respect to a moral divinity by the sublimity of thoughts, the majesty of cadences, the boldness of figures, the force of expressions. At the same time, it wards off distaste by brevity, by the variety of its turns, and by the choice of the embellishments that a skillful poet knows how to use at the right time. Political authority. No man has received from nature the right to command others. Liberty is a gift from heaven, and each individual of the same species has the right to enjoy it as soon as he enjoys the use of reason. If nature has established any authority, it is paternal control, but paternal control has its limits, and in the state of nature it would terminate when the children could take care of themselves. Any other authority comes from another origin than nature. If one seriously considers this matter, one will always go back to the one of these two sources, either the force and the violence of an individual who has seized it, or the consent of those who have submitted to it by a contract made or assumed between them and the individual on whom they have bestowed authority. Power that is acquired by violence is only usurpation and only lasts as long as the force of the individual who commands can prevail over the force of those who obey, in such a way that if the latter become in their turn the strongest party and then shake off the yoke, they do it with as much right and justice as the other who had imposed it upon them. The same law that made authority can destroy it, for this is the law of might. Sometimes authority that is established by violence changes its nature. This is when it continues and is maintained with the express consent of those who have been brought into its subjection. But in this case, it reverts to the second case about which I am going to speak, and the individual who had arrogated it then becomes a prince, ceasing to be a tyrant. Power that comes from the consent of the people necessarily presupposes certain conditions that make its use legitimate, useful to society, advantageous to the republic, and set it and restrict it between limits. For man must not nor cannot give himself entirely and without reserve to another man, because he has master superior to everything, to whom he alone belongs in his entire being. It is God, whose power always has a direct bearing on each creature, a master as jealous as absolute, who never loses his rights and does not transfer them. He permits for the common good and for the maintenance of society that men establish among themselves an order of subordination, that they obey one of them, but he wishes that it be done with reason and proportion and not by blindness and without reservation, so that the creature does not arrogate the rights of the Creator. Any other submission is the veritable crime of the idolatry. To bend one's knee before a man or an image is merely an external ceremony about which the true God, who demands the heart and the mind, hardly cares, and which he leaves to the institution of men to do with as they please. The tokens of civil and political devotion or of religious worship. Thus it is not these ceremonies in themselves, but the spirit of their establishment that makes their observance innocent or criminal. An Englishman has no scruples about serving the king on one knee. The ceremonial only signifies what people want it to signify. But to deliver one's heart, spirit, and conduct without any reservation to the will and caprice of a mere creature, making him the unique and final reason for one's actions, is assuredly a crime of divine lese majesty of the highest degree. Otherwise, this power of God about which one speaks so much would only be empty noise that human politics would use out of pure fantasy, and which the spirit of irreligion could play with it in its return, so that all ideas concerning power and subordination, coming to the point of merging, the prince would trifle with God, and the subject with the prince. The prince owes to his very subjects the authority that he has over them, and this authority is limited by the laws of nature and the state. The laws of nature and the state are the conditions under which they have submitted or are supposed to have submitted to its government. One of these conditions is that, not having any power or authority over them, but by their choice and consent, he can never employ his authority to break the act or the contract by which it was transferred to him. From that time on he would work against himself, since his authority could only subsist by virtue of the right that established it. Whoever annuls one destroys the other. The prince cannot therefore dispose of his power and his subjects without the consent of the nation and independently of the option indicated in the contract of allegiance. If he proceeded otherwise, everything would be nullified, and the laws would relieve him of the promises and the oaths that he would have been able to make, as a minor who would have acted without full knowledge of the facts, since he would have claimed to have at his disposal that which he only had in trust and with a cause of entail. In the same way, as if he had had it on in his full ownership, and without any condition. Moreover, the government, although hereditary in a family and placed in the hands of one person, is not private property, but public property that consequently can never be taken from the people, to whom it belongs exclusively, fundamentally, and as a freehold. Consequently, it is always the people who make the lease or the agreement. They always intervene in the contract that adjudges its exercise. It is not the state that belongs to the prince. It is the prince who belongs to the state, but it does rest with the prince to govern in the state, because the state has chosen him for that purpose. He has bound himself to the people and the administration of affairs, and they in their turn are bound to obey him according to the laws. The person who wears the crown can certainly discharge himself of it completely if he wishes, but he cannot replace it on the head of another without the consent of the nation who has placed it on his. In a word, the crown, the government, and the public authority are possessions owned by the body of the nation, held as a usufruct by the princes and as a trust by ministers. Although heads of state, they are none the less members of it. As a matter of fact, the first, the most venerable, and the most powerful, allowed everything in order to govern, allowed nothing legitimately to change the established government or to place another head in their place. The scepter of Louis XV necessarily passes to his eldest son, and there is no power who can oppose this, nor any nation, because it is a condition of the contract, nor his father for the same reason. The depository of authority is sometimes only for a limited time, as in the Roman Republic. It is sometimes for the life of only one man, as in Poland, sometimes for all the time a family exists, as in England, sometimes for the time a family exists only through its male descendants, as in France. This depository is sometimes entrusted to a certain class in society, sometimes to several people chosen by all the classes, and sometimes to one man. The conditions of this pact are different in different states, but everywhere the nation has a right to maintain against all forces the contract that they have made. No power can change it, and when it is no longer valid, the nation recovers its rights and full freedom to enter into a new one with whomever and however it pleases them. This is what would happen in France if by the greatest of misfortunes the entire reigning family happened to die out, including the most remote descendants. Then the scepter and the crown would return to the nation. It seems that only slaves whose minds are as limited as their hearts are debased could think otherwise. Such men are born neither for the glory of the prince, nor for the benefit of society. They have neither virtue nor greatness of soul. Fear and self-interest are the motives of their conduct. Nature only produces them to improve by contrast the worth of virtuous men, and Providence uses them to make tyrannical powers, with which it chastises as a rule the people and the sovereigns who offend God, the latter for usurping, the former for granting too much to the man of supreme power that the Creator reserved for himself over the created being. The observation of laws, the conservation of liberty, and the love of country are the prolific sources of all great things, and of all beautiful actions. Here we can find the happiness of people, and the luster of princes who govern them. Here obedience is glorious, and command august. On the contrary, flattery, self-interest, and the spirit of slavery are at the root of all evils that overpower a state, and of all the cowardice that dishonor it. There the subjects are miserable, and the prince is hated. There the monarch has never heard himself proclaimed the beloved. Submission is hateful there, and domination cruel. If I view France and Turkey from the same perspective, I perceive on the one hand a society of men united by reason, activated by virtue, and governed by a head of state equally wise and glorious according to the laws of justice. On the other, a herd of animals assembled by habit, driven by the law of the rod, and led by an absolute master according to his caprice. Savages, barbarous people, who live without law, without governance, without religion, and who have no fixed habitation. This word comes from the Italian selvaggio, derived from Helveticus, and Silveticus, which signifies the same thing as sylvestris, rustic, or that which concerns wood and forests, because savages ordinarily dwell in forests. A large part of America is peopled by savages, the majority of whom are still fierce and feed upon human flesh. The slave trade, commerce of Africa, is the buying of unfortunate Negroes by Europeans on the coast of Africa to use as slaves in their colonies. This buying of Negroes, to reduce them to slavery, is one business that violates religion, morality, natural laws, and all the rights of human nature. Negroes, says a modern Englishman full of enlightenment and humanity, have not become slaves by the right of war, neither do they deliver themselves voluntarily into bondage, and consequently their children are not born slaves. Nobody is unaware that they are brought from their own princes, who claim to have the right to dispose of their liberty, and that traders have them transported in the same way as their other goods, either in their colonies or in America, where they are displayed for sale. If commerce of this kind can be justified by a moral principle, there is no crime, however atrocious it may be, that cannot be made legitimate. Kings, princes, and magistrates are not the proprietors of their subjects. They do not, therefore, have the right to dispose of their liberty and to sell them as slaves. On the other hand, no man has the right to buy them or to make himself their master. Men and their liberty are not objects of commerce. They can be neither sold, nor bought, nor paid for at any price. We must conclude from this that a man whose slave has run away should only blame himself, since he had acquired for money illicit goods whose acquisition is prohibited by all the laws of humanity and equity. There is not, therefore, a single one of these unfortunate people regarded only as slaves who does not have the right to be declared free, since he has never lost his freedom, which he could not lose, and which has his prince, his father, and any person whatsoever in the world had not the power to dispose of. Consequently, the sale that has been completed is invalid in itself. This Negro does not divest himself, and cannot never divest himself of his natural right. He carries it everywhere with him, and he can demand everywhere that he be allowed to enjoy it. It is, therefore, patent inhumanity on the part of judges in free countries where he is transported, not to emancipate him immediately by declaring him free, since he is their fellow man, having a soul like them. There are authors who, posing as political jurists, come to tell us confidently that the questions relative to the state of persons must be decided by the laws of the countries in which they belong, and that therefore a man who is declared a slave in America and who is transported from there to Europe must be regarded there as a slave. But this is to decide the rights of humanity by the civil laws of the gutter. As Cicero says, must the magistrates of a nation, out of consideration for another nation, have no regard for their own people? Must their deference to a law that binds them in no way make them trample under foot of the law of nature that binds all men at all times and in all places? Is there any law as obligatory as the eternal laws of equity? What problem is created if a judge is bound to observe them more than to respect the arbitrary and inhuman practices of the colonies? One will say, perhaps, that these colonies will soon be ruined if the slavery of Negroes were abolished there. But if this were true, should we conclude from this that the human race must be horribly injured to enrich us and to provide us with luxuries? It is true that the pockets of highwaymen would be empty if robbery were to be entirely suppressed, but do men have the right to enrich themselves by cruel and criminal acts? What right has a bandit to rob travelers? Who is allowed to become opulent by making his fellow man unfortunate? Can it be legitimate to rob mankind of its most sacred rights solely to satisfy one's avarice, one's vanity, or one's particular passions? No. Therefore, Let the European colonies be destroyed rather than make so many unfortunate people. But I believe it is false that the suppression of slavery would entail its ruin. Commerce would suffer for some time, I agree. This is the effect of all new arrangements, because in the case new trade relations could not be readily found to follow another economic system. But out of this suppression, other advantages would arise. It is this slave trade, this practice of slavery, that has prevented America from being populated as promptly as it would have been. Let them free the Negroes, and in a few generations this vast and fertile country will have innumerable inhabitants. The acts and talent will flourish there. And instead of a land populated almost entirely by savages and wild beasts, there will soon be a country of industrious men. It is freedom, it is industry that are the real sources of abundance. As long as a nation conserves this industry and this freedom, it has nothing to fear. Industry, as well as the necessity, is ingenious and inventive. It finds 1,000 different ways to procure riches for itself, and if one of the channels to opulence is blocked, 100 others immediately open up. Sensible and generous souls will without a doubt applaud these reasons in favor of humanity, but avarice and greed, which dominate the earth, will never wish to hear them. Wife. In Latin, uxor, female of man, considered such when she is united to him by the ties of marriage. See, therefore, marriage, marriage natural law, marriage jurisprudence, marriage theology, and husband. The Supreme Being, having judged that it was not good for man to be alone, conceived a desire to unite him in close society with a companion, and this society is made through a voluntary accord between the parties. As this society has as its principal goal the procreation and protection of the children it produces, the father and the mother of necessity devote all their energies to nourishing and properly rearing the fruits of their love up until the time when they are able to care and judge for themselves. But although the husband and the wife have fundamentally the same interests in their marriage, it is nevertheless essential that governing authority belong to one or the other. Now the affirmative right of civilized nations, the laws and the customs of Europe, give this authority unanimously to the male, being the one endowed with the greatest strength of mind and body, contributing more to the common good in matters of sacred and human things, such that the woman must necessarily be subordinated to her husband and obey his orders in all domestic affairs. This is the belief of the ancient and modern jurists and the formal decision of legislators. In addition, the Frederican Code, which appeared first in 1750, and which seems to have attempted to introduce definitive and universal rights, declares that the husband is according to nature itself the master of the house, the chief of the family, and that it therefore follows that the wife resides there at his leave. She is in all regards under the power of the husband, from which fact evolve in diverse prerogatives which pertain personally to him. Finally, Holy Scripture commands the wife to submit to him as to her master. However, the reasons we've just listed for martial power are not without rejoinder, humanely speaking, and the character of this work allows us to boldly enunciate them. It appears first of all that it would be difficult to demonstrate that the authority of the husband comes from nature, because this principle is contrary to the natural equality of men, and just because one is suited for commanding doesn't mean that it is actually one's right to do so. 2. Man does not always have greater strength of body, wisdom, spirit, or conduct than woman. 3. Scriptural precepts being established in punitive terms indicates as well that there is only a positive right. One can therefore claim that there is no other type of subordination in marital relations than that of civil law, and as a consequence, the only things preventing change in the civil law are particular conventions, and that natural law and religion do not determine anything to the contrary. We do not deny that in a society composed of two people, It is necessary that the deliberative laws of one or the other carry the day. And since ordinarily men are more capable than women of aptly governing particular matters, it is wise to establish as a general rule that the voice of the man will carry more weight as long as the two have not made any agreement to the contrary, because general law results from human institutions, and not from natural right. In this way, a woman who knows the basis of civil law and who contracts her marriage purely and simply has by law submitted tactically to this civil law. But if this woman, persuaded that she has more judgment and direction, or knowing that she has greater fortune or is of higher station than that of the man who asks her to marry him, stipulates the contrary of that which the law implies, and which with the consent of the husband, should she not have, by virtue of natural law, the same power her husband has by the virtue of the law of the realm. The case of a queen who, being sovereign in her own right, marries a prince below her rank, or if she likes, one of her subjects, is enough to show that the authority of a woman over her husband, even in matters concerning the governance of a family, is not incompatible with the nature of marital contract. In effect, we have seen among the most civilized nations marriages which submit the husband to the domain of the wife. We have seen a princess, heir to the realm, reserved to herself, while marrying the sovereign power of the state. Everyone knows the conventions of marriage which were made between Philip II and Mary Queen of England, those of Mary Queen of Scots, and those of Ferdinand and Isabel, in order to govern the kingdom of Castile together. The examples of England and of Muscovy make evident that women can succeed equally both in moderate and despotic government, and if it is not against reason and nature that they rule an empire, then it would seem that it is no more contradictory that then they should be mistress in a family. When Lacedaemonian marriages were made ready to be consummated, the woman took the dress of a man, and it was a symbol of the equal power that she would share with her husband. On this subject we know what Gorgo, the wife of Leonidas, king of Sparta, said to a foreign woman who was extremely surprised by this equality. "Don't you know," responded the queen, "that we bring men into the world? In other times, even in Egypt, marriage contracts between individuals, as much as those of the king and queen, gave authority over the husband to the wife. It makes no difference, because it is not a matter here of exploiting unique examples which prove too much. It makes no difference, I say, if the authority of a woman in marriage cannot exist within conventional bounds, between people of equal stature. At least let the legislature refrain from prohibiting exceptions to the law, made with the free consent of the parties. Marriage is by its nature a contract, and as a result, in all things not expressly prohibited by natural law, the contractual engagements between the husband and the wife determine reciprocal rights. Finally, why should the ancient maxim, provisio humanitas tollit provisionem legis, not be accepted in this case, such as one allows it in dowries, in the division of goods, and in several other things, where the law does not rule except when the parties have not stipulated provisions different from those prescribed by law?